Well, AJ, it's been a long 20 months, hasn't it?
Yeah, man.
A long, hard 20 months. Things have been constantly changing, and we're looking for ways to navigate this COVID reality and having effective communication around it. And I'm sure people wish we would communicate more about COVID, and I know some people wish we would talk less about COVID because we're sick of dealing with this all the time, and it's just dominating the topics of conversation. But we've been getting a few recurring questions around the pandemic, mostly about some different protocol type stuff. And usually, if three or four people are asking questions about these types of things and wondering, there's probably others that are thinking the same thing. And so, we just want to take 20 to 25 minutes to really address kind of the state of the pandemic as it relates to deep water. And so we're going to do that. There's lots of questions. So, AJ, you're our lead pastor. So it makes sense that you're the one to address this and speak to this. So how is the staff doing? How is the church doing in terms of navigating COVID in this season?
Yeah, that's a big question. The truth is, COVID has been incredibly tough on all of us. I mean, myself, our staff, our volunteers, the church in general. It's been stressful. It's been draining. It's been difficult. It's been full of challenges and empty of momentum. A lot of times over the last 5 years, Deepwater has kind of felt like a runaway train, usually in good ways. But in this season, it's felt a little bit more like we're like trying to push a train up a hill, and that hasn't been my personal favorite. I know for me personally, certainly there have been windows in this season that have been some of the most disappointing and discouraging and distracted seasons of ministry for me. Like even just Saturday, so 2 days ago from when we're filming this, I'd planned to come into the office for 4 or 5 hours and get a bunch of work done. And I did wind up coming into the office and I did wind up working for 4 or 5 hours, but it was all exposure notification stuff, none of the stuff that was actually on my to-do list for the day. So we're all kind of frustrated and tired after 20 months of pandemic. But I've been saying this from the start. I think the biggest risk we face as a church in this pandemic is not from the disease itself, and it's not from the different kind of directives and restrictions from public health. The single biggest challenge, the single biggest risk we face is the same thing it always is for a church, which is division. That's right. And so, kind of on the top end of this video, I just want to take a couple of minutes here and talk through how that division stuff plays out. Like in movies these days, there's this really kind of popular trope, where there's different timelines, and sometimes they have to like time travel to fix timelines. And so there is a timeline. I'm not saying it's the one we're in, but there's a timeline where 3 or 6 months from now, Deepwater's kind of a mess of division. That's not specific to Deepwater. I think every church is facing this right now. But so I want to take a few minutes here and just talk about kind of how I think the steps in that timeline go, and then what are the things we can do to kind of correct that timeline. And so I think that timeline starts with unchecked fear. Division usually starts with fear, and fear is already present for most of us. I think all of us are at least in step one of the timeline, the bad timeline. Whether you're more afraid of COVID or more afraid of the vaccine or more afraid of people's lack of trust in science or more afraid of people's, of government overreach, like no matter what side of these issues you're on, no matter what you think or feel about the specifics, most of us, the fear is there and it's real. And that's not the same as saying every fear is well-founded, but people are really feeling them. And there's probably some truth in most people's fears and probably some paranoia in most people's fears, but we are all experiencing them. And so with all due respect to most angels in the Bible, telling people who are afraid, don't be afraid, is not usually the most productive strategy. The truth is, we don't have anything to fear, right? God is with us, but there are things to be concerned about, and it's really easy when we don't check those concerns or check those fears for them to drift from healthy, understandable concern into just unbridled, unchecked fear. And so no matter what our perspective is on vaccination or masks or proof of vaccination or 2-year-long states of emergency or people being required to surrender their bodily autonomy in order to keep their job or whatever, we're living in unprecedented times, absolutely. And so we're all concerned. We all see ways this could get worse. We're all frustrated. And at times, I think if we're being honest, we're all like a little scared, a little afraid. And we might not all see the boat the same way, but we're all in it. And none of us want it to sink, and none of us want to drown. We all wish we weren't here. And so I think we need to realize that people on the other side of any given COVID issue are having just as terrible a time as we are. Like, no one's happy that we're here. They're just as scared as you are, no matter what you disagree with them on. And I think there's an opportunity for us to let that shared experience, focus less on the things we disagree on and more on the fact that we're all in this really rough, really scary experience, actually give us common ground with each other and create empathy, right? Like, none of us want to be in this. So I would say step one in this bad timeline is just unchecked fear. Like, we're not thinking about our fears, we're just letting them run wild. And the antidote to that is to realize all of us are afraid. All of us are concerned. And we can have empathy with each other around that, just going like, we see it differently, but we're in it together. And then the next step after that, I think, when we let those fears run wild, is what I would call unquestionable certainty. So we're afraid, we're confused, we grasp for certainty. We hope that that'll be kind of a doorway to control. Like, if we can nail down all these moving parts, then we can control this situation. And so we turn, it seems or odds are into like absolute unimpeachable fact. And it's not just a fact that exists, but it's a fact that everyone should see and everyone should agree with me on, right? Because once we lock onto something as the thing that mitigates against what we fear, we desperately need other people to agree with us on that in order for us to feel safe again. And again, I think that's what most of us we just want to feel safe again.
Survival.
Yeah, 100%. It's please take down this risk because I don't want to be afraid, right? So we become not only sure that we're right, but sure, which, this is the logical conclusion, that everyone else is wrong, right? And so we move from things like the vaccine has more side effects than I'm comfortable with to the whole world is going to be like filled with zombies in 6 months because everyone took this vaccine. Or we move from people who don't get the vaccine, they pose an increased risk of serious disease to themselves and an increased risk of transmission to other people should they contract COVID, to everyone who's not vaccinated is just crawling with COVID and they want nothing more than to give it to you and your family, kind of a thing, right? Like, things become too clear, too polarized, too extreme, right? And so that desire for control makes us think that if everyone just agreed with us, it would remove all the risk, right? That it's the disagreement that's the source of the danger or the risk, not the situation. And so we become not just certain about the facts of the situation, right? But we believe that if everyone agreed with us and cooperated with us, we could control it. And so when we find ourselves in this kind of second step, this unquestionable certainty, the way we fix that is with a healthy dose of humility, right? Not abandoning the idea of facts, not abandoning the idea of knowledge, but realizing that like we're all making the best call we know to make with what we understand. And some of us might be completely wrong. None of us are completely right. These kinds of situations are not a question of who's right and who's wrong. They're a question of who is the least wrong. and only, it's going to be several more years before we have any sort of even beginning real idea of who was the most right, who was the most wrong. But no one was absolutely right. No one ever is. And so that number two, that unquestionable certainty, and the way we correct that timeline is with deep humility. And then the third phase, this is kind of the one where we're starting to get into some real danger, I think, but before it's moving into that too late zone, is what I would call unlimited judgment. So once we've kind of, in an attempt to quell our fears and mitigate risk, we've established certainty, then we can judge people who don't agree with us, right? So we don't limit ourselves to judgment on is this action wise or not, but instead we start thinking in terms of the other person's mind and heart. So these are no longer people who have a different perspective on us or a different set of things they're comfortable with. They're now like stupid or bad or dangerous, right? And so they're stupid because they don't understand science, or they're naive because they don't trust the government, or they do trust the government too much, or they're careless because they don't follow all the directives, or they're careless because they injected something into their body that didn't exist 20 months ago, right? And so we start getting down to assigning worst possible motives, and we start making value judgments on people based on the extent to which they agree with what we seem to think is reality in that situation. And so they're no longer well-intentioned people doing the best they can with the understanding they have. They're now bad people doing bad things for bad reasons. And once we get there, see, this is the real flip side of that danger, is we now see ourselves as virtuous. Like now this becomes a way we can be kind of pharisaical,
like
almost in a way.
superiority.
Yeah. Like they're bad, I'm good, right? And so we begin to see ourselves as superior in intellect or moral character or compassion or understanding, right? And this is where, church, our theology is of huge help to us, right? I can tell you with absolute authority that anyone who disagrees with me on issues of COVID is a bad person. But I can also tell you with the same authority that anyone who does agree with me is a bad person. Anyone who doesn't agree with me is a bad person. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, right? There's no good people in the mix. And until Jesus shows up and hands us his report on COVID, we're not going to have heard from a person who is a good person. Yeah, I'd tune into that press conference. And so the reality is that none of us are morally good, I don't think, or morally bad because of our views on COVID. We're doing the best we can. And so, but even if it were true, though, like even if people who saw it differently than you, or if there is someone who's just like, I want to see the world burn, you still got to love them, right? We got to love everyone, right?
You can't get out of love.
No, it doesn't. Like, even if you can find out a way that they're a bad person and your enemy, Jesus is still going, but you got to love them, right? And so the idea here is, instead of unrestrained judgment, unlimited judgment, we got to show people grace. We got to love them anyway, right? We love other people despite what we might see as their weaknesses or their faults, because God loved us despite all of our weaknesses and all of our faults. That idea of grace, like that's the core of what we believe. That's the core of who we are and what we preach. And I know a lot of Christians like to complain about how judgy Christians can be. It's almost like a popular thing to talk about how judgy we are among ourselves, right? But in my experience, man, there's very little that I've witnessed in my life where Christians are quicker to judge other Christians than on this COVID stuff. So I'm happy to be on the record. I'm fully vaccinated. I got the AstraZeneca, like the 20 minutes that it wouldn't kill you. Then I followed up with the Moderna. I am super pro-vaccine. On a personal level, you ask me as your friend, I'd say, yeah, I would totally encourage you to get vaccinated. But listen, if you're unvaccinated or anti-vaccinated, or even if you're convinced that like if you get vaccinated, Bill Gates is going to come to your house and steal your Wi-Fi, or however that theory works, right? I don't know. There's always a new theory. Right? Listen, I want you to know, if that's you, I love you. And I'm happy to be your pastor, and I'm glad to be your friend. And I'm not looking down on you. We as a staff aren't looking down on you and judging you because you're making the best decisions you know to make at the time. Even if we think they're not necessarily the best decisions, we're not looking at that as a reflection on you or your character or your intellect or whatever else. So let's show each other grace. Let's not assume that the reason that someone sees these issues differently is because they're, brain dead and want to kill your grandmother, or because they're a sheep just being controlled by the government, man. And even if they were, still got to love them, right? So let's give each other the benefit of the doubt, church. Let's assume that each other have good motives, even when we think those motives are leading to less than wise or safe actions. Let's realize that all of us have been shaped by our past and our experiences, what we've been through, and you don't know what someone else has been through. You don't know how they were raised. You don't know what their experiences have been. and that might be kind of influencing their perspectives and opinions. So step 3, unlimited judgment. The way we correct the timeline is with copious amounts of grace. And then step 4 is just straight up separation. We just begin to separate. So now that I've established that I'm right and you're wrong, and therefore I'm good and you're bad, then I want to begin to separate myself from you, to distance myself from you, because you're unclean, right? I don't want to put up with you. I don't want to catch what you have, either virally or ideologically. And to be honest, I don't want people to kind of assume I think like you, right? I don't want to be guilty by association. So I begin to separate from you, to withdraw from you emotionally and relational, begin to see you as a them. And, then there's me and the people who think like me as an us, right? And so I keep my distance. I make it clear that I'm not with you. Now, I realize that some of us are or live with people who are at significantly higher risk of serious disease due to COVID-19. And because of that, some of us have needed to be like extra vigilant about physical distancing from other people in general and that kind of thing. And I want to be clear, that is not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about separating yourself relationally. So this is not about like when I hang out with my friends, it needs to be on Zoom. This is, I don't want to be friends with that person anymore because we disagree about this issue, right? Or this is not about we have to interact in a way that, makes sense safety-wise for my situation. This is just I'm done interacting with that person, right? So step 4 is separation. And the way we fix the timeline there, again, is just to lean back into community, right? To realize the importance of community and go back to steps 1 through 3, right? And kind of work back from there. I believe that the loss of relational community in our churches and in our communities at large will be proven historically to be the single biggest damaging thing coming out of this pandemic. Not death, not crippling debt for generations. I think that loss of community, that's the thing that has the potential to really tear down a whole culture, a whole society. And so I want to implore people to be really intentional about staying in community, about leaning in to community. Make that a really, really high priority. And then wrapping this part up, step 5 is just full-on unrestrained fighting, right? So once you get here, like you're no longer my brother or my sister, you're now an enemy to oppose, right? My goal is no longer to serve you, but to disconnect from and defeat you. And so at worst, I want to see you crushed by kind of your own unwise choices or whatever. At worst, I want to actively hurt you because I feel like you're a bad person or whatever. And I see you as kind of justifiable collateral damage, right? And sort of this attitude of, how dare you stand in front of the speeding bus that is my righteous indignation. Like it becomes this fight sort of thing. And while theologically, I believe that God has the power to restore anything, the truth of the matter is once a group of people, a church included, get to this point, odds are it's over.
Yeah, it's hard to come back from.
Totally. Like I think of like a marriage where there's been all kinds of infidelity and betrayal, like a track record of that. And, I've seen those couples come to a place where there's forgiveness, where things are amicable. Sometimes even the marriage, at least technically, survives. But it ain't never the same, And so we want to avoid things getting to step 5. Yeah, exactly. We want to, ideally we want to nip this in the bud at step 1. But certainly if you're kind of coming into step 5, it's time to sort it out and before you get there. And so I want to just encourage people. We're going to move on here in just a minute to some other real practical stuff, but think through that. And kind of place yourself on that timeline, right? Because we're not necessarily all on it at the same point together. And so if you're going like, man, I have been afraid, and that's kind of started to tweak how I look at other people in my church community, have some empathy, If you found yourself, all of a sudden you feel like you've got this just unimpeachable, unquestionable clarity around things, like try to remind yourself that people who disagree with you feel like they have the exact same level of clarity you do. And just have enough humility to go like, we don't ultimately know. Like, again, I'm pro-science, I'm pro-research, but all there's so many moving parts in this thing that that sort of this is just an absolute black and white, and anyone who doesn't see it my way is a bad person thing is not helping anyone. And if you're getting to that point of, again, of like judgment, have some grace, right? Like even if the reason they think the way they think about this is because they're a terrible person, you still have to love them.
Right.
It's like a 99.999% chance it's not that, but even if it is, right? And yeah, lean into community, prioritize that stuff, it matters.
That's right. Thank you, AJ. I appreciate sharing that with us. In terms of the practical things that people need to know, as you're aware, I'm aware, we've had some exposures in our church community recently. Can you speak a little bit to some of those notices that have came forward and what our response has been, and just reassure people in terms of how we've handled that situation?
100%, yeah. So our strategy with so we had an exposure notification come in 10 days after the exposure a couple of weeks ago, and then we had another one just this past weekend. The first one was for Dartmouth, and at the time we weren't privy to this information, but we learned after the fact that it was that the person who was the source of that exposure was only in the kind of large main big church, as the kids call it. They weren't in our kids ministry area. And then this most recent one was over here in Halifax at 9:30 in our upstream space, in our kids space. First of all, I do want to say this. I want to thank all the people who went and got tested following that. I think that's a good thing to do practically, and I think it's a great testimony. I mentioned this in a Facebook Live video, but after the Dartmouth exposure notification came in, I got a message about 2-3 hours after we sent that out, which was like an hour after we got the letter from Public Health. We've been very quick on turnaround on this stuff. I got a text from one of our longtime members who he said he was at the testing site in Dartmouth, I think at the Dartmouth General. He said, "There's so many Deepwater people here, we could just have church here tonight," right? Which I think is awesome. That's such a great way to respond. And so, yeah, I should also clarify, following up from that too, there's been no evidence that we've been made aware of additional exposures, of anyone testing positive. Like we haven't, from everything we can tell, somebody who unknowingly had COVID walked in and walked right back out with the same amount of COVID they came in with. One of the rare times we're against sharing in church world. And then again this past week, exposure notification came in. We got that out to you as quick as we could. And part of our practice has been to over communicate with that stuff. So technically, according to public health, we're only required to communicate with the people we know were there. But we've wanted just the whole church to be aware of what's going on and what our response to that is. And so, yeah, that's kind of where that stuff is at. I wish there was a way we could prevent it. There isn't. I know that for most adults, if you're vaccinated, it's just a matter of going and getting tested, which isn't that huge a deal. We know for kids it's a bigger deal. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But yeah, those have been I know some people too are kind of like, man, that's 2 exposures in 3 weeks. It's also 2 exposures in 20 months.
That's right.
And I think it's helpful to keep that in perspective as well.
That's good. AJ, one of the big ongoing questions that we as a church are navigating, and we as a society are around proof of vaccinations. And so could you just update us on what is the reality around proof of vaccinations in regards to adults?
Yeah. So with adults, in full keeping with the directives of public health, we don't require proof of vaccination to attend kind of our primary worship gatherings. So Thursday night and twice on Sunday, proof of vaccination is not required. And again, that's fully in keeping with public health. Celebrate Recovery doesn't require proof of vaccination because it is a support for people with addictions and mental health, and there's kind of different kind of guidelines around that. But of course, if you are an adult and have symptoms consistent with COVID-19, please stay home and go get tested. But we are never going to be turning people away from a chance to hear the gospel and be part of worshiping Jesus in community because they don't show us the required paperwork. That said, for less kind of foundational events, again, in full keeping with the directives of public health, we are requiring proof of vaccination. So we had like a coffee house last month. that required proof of vaccination. We did a fantastic multi-ethnic potluck a couple of days ago. That required proof of vaccination. If you're ever in doubt about an event requiring proof of vaccination, you can always ask whoever's leading the event. I promise you we're on top of this stuff. We're constantly having those conversations around how do we apply those guidelines properly.
Awesome. And is there, what are the proof of vaccination requirements with teens and youth? Are they different? Are they the same?
Yeah.
How does that work?
So for our youth ministry called Riptide, that'd be grades 7 to 12. It's a little bit more nuanced in this situation. Public health has been very clear that proof of vaccination is not required for those regular weekly worship gatherings. They've also stated that proof of vaccination is required for youth events. And so that creates a bit of a kind of an interpretive challenge for us, because Riptide is an event and it is for youth, so there's no denying that, but it also absolutely is one of our regular weekly worship gatherings. For our teens, Tuesday nights is their faith gathering. I have a son in 11th grade, and I can guarantee you he is far more dialed in to what's going on Tuesday nights than he is on Sunday morning. But beyond that, we have a significant number of teens who are involved in Riptide whose parents don't come to this church or go to any church. And so this is, like, Tuesday nights is literally their one chance to gather in worship with a faith community in a given week. And so, again, we're not going to turn people away who want to hear the gospel. We're not going to turn people away who want to worship Jesus in community and be discipled and all those kind of things, because they, or especially in the case of our teens, more likely their parents, are hesitant about the vaccine. So here's kind of how we're handling that, very similar to with the adults. Tuesday night Riptide is one of our weekly faith gatherings, right? One of, as of today, 8. We got Tuesday night, Thursday night, 2 on Sunday in Halifax, 2 on Sunday in Dartmouth, and then 2 upstreams, 1 in Halifax and 1 in Dartmouth. And we're not requiring proof of vaccination to participate in any of those. And so Tuesday night, again, it's one of our weekly worship gatherings. This one's targeted at teenagers. But for any extra stuff, any extracurricular stuff, for example, I think coming up this month, there's going to be like a family movie night thing. That will require proof of vaccination. Any of those kind of above and beyond the regular weekly worship stuff will require proof of vaccination.
Cool. And so recently there's been a lot of conversation around vaccinations in terms of children.
Yeah.
And so what does proof of vaccinations look like for us in terms of kids?
Yeah, so with kids ministry, of course, it's different because kids can't be vaccinated yet. I mean, they can start in another couple of days, but kids won't be fully vaccinated basically till March break, roughly speaking. So really what we'd be talking about there is, what about adults or teenagers, people who are workers in upstream. And we're aware that proof of vaccination is a requirement for teachers at this point, but like public school teachers and stuff, but public health continues to give us very faith group specific guidelines to follow. So it's not like we're without expert input on these things. And on this particular issue, the Department of Health has said, Public Health has said proof of vaccination is not a requirement for those working with kids as a part of that regular kind of Sunday morning program thing. And so that's kind of the advice that we're following. And I don't want to get us in a place where we're trying to set ourselves up to be the experts in public health restrictions and policies and all that kind of stuff, as opposed to Dr. Strang and his team. But there are some concerns, and some parents have expressed some kind of questions around that. And so 2 of these, one directly related to vaccination, and then another that we'll talk about now because we're on the subject. But the first is around that question of the potential for a kid to contract COVID in upstream. And so, again, we're trusting the risk analysis of public health on whether or not proof of vaccination for those workers would be helpful. And we're following that guideline. But we also acknowledge that there are those concerns and that they're there and they're real. And so our policy moving forward for in-person upstream stuff is going to be that workers can either show proof of vaccination or they can take a rapid test and have a negative test result within 24 hours of when they're supposed to serve. Obviously, if there'll be a detailed policy on this that'll go out to workers and parents, but if they choose proof of vaccination, that's just a one-off thing. Like we'll know that that's been done. If it's a test thing, obviously that's not a like get tested once and keep coming every week. Each week that they're scheduled to serve, they would need to take that test and let us know that it came back negative. We feel like that kind of balances the concerns on either side of the question. Like some parents and some workers aren't comfortable with the concept, even some who are fully vaccinated but aren't comfortable with the concept of proof of vaccination. And then some parents and workers on the other side are concerned about the idea of people who aren't vaccinated. And so we feel like this kind of hopefully threads that needle in a way that doesn't create an unnecessarily divisive dynamic in the church. And then the other question, and from what I'm hearing through Pastor Jackie from our families, the greater concern is not actually around COVID itself, but around COVID exposures, because as in exposure notifications, because it's just incredible upheaval for families. To have an elementary school age kid have to isolate in their room for 7 days when that if they get that notification right away quick. And that's actually more common with schools. Both exposures are more common in schools, and they seem to get those exposure notifications out faster. And so a lot of families are just trying to balance that tension of like locking your 8-year-old in their bedroom for a week. That's not a real healthy, great thing. And so they're trying to kind of navigate what are ways we can mitigate some of the potential for those exposure notifications and all that kind of stuff. So in light of that, this week I'm working with Pastor Jackie on kind of an assessment of how we as a church can best serve families during this season. And it may be that the right move is to shift our focus back to online until kind of that March break window when kids have the opportunity to be vaccinated. Online is always a thing, like it's never gone away. And so if that's what your family needs to lean into, whether we're offering it in person or not, you can do that. But in theory, once all the kids who are going to be vaccinated are vaccinated, then if there's an exposure notification at their school or at their dancing class or at church, wherever that happens, they still need to get tested, but they would need to do the isolation as it is with vaccinated people. And so that will certainly change the water on the beans, as I often say, and Pastor Megan gets confused by. Yeah.
Cool. Last question, AJ. A lot of people have been asking and wondering, what about cafe and communion? What's the update on that?
Yeah. So right now we're targeting early in the new year, like somewhere in January, for the return of cafe and the return of weekly communion. Again, of course, the primary consideration with both those things is that drinking and eating requires you to have your mask off. And so with that in mind, we're going to be promoting a new maneuver. We're calling it the slip and sip.
Can you show us?
I don't have my mask on me here, but the idea is this, right? Holding a drink in your hand does not replace having a mask on. And so we're not going to be doing a thing where like you grab a coffee and then hold it all day and don't have to wear a mask. So what we're saying is whether it's coffee or for communion, you just slip and sip.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, it's going to be the hot new dance craze that's sweeping. So maybe that's a slip down. Maybe it's a slip. Maybe it's a slip to the side. But yeah, slip and sip. So that's going to be the technique. You can be practicing that at home if you want. So when coffee comes back, when communion every week comes back, that's going to kind of be the idea that this is not like a restaurant where you take your mask off and just hang out, but just slip and sip.
Awesome.
So anyways, early in the new year, that's the plan.
Cool, man. Well, AJ, thank you for that thorough update. We appreciate that. And so here's the deal, Deepwater. The pandemic is here for a while yet. And we want to be wise about reducing the transmission of this disease and this virus. But also, as a church, we want to be aware that it's impossible to have a 0% risk as we navigate this. We're going to do our best to follow the guidelines and the protocols around this pandemic and how we respond that public health has given us. We're also not going to be turning people away who want to come and worship and experience the gospel, experience Christian community. And at the end of the day, we are here to work towards our mission of helping people become passionate followers of Jesus Christ. We are not going to allow the enemy to divide us and discourage us and dissuade us away from that mission. We are always going to be a church who is on mission to seeking and saving those who are lost and being a place where people can find community and find their calling and their purpose in this world. And so that mission never will stop. We will continue to be a church who has a posture of empathy, a church that has a posture of showing grace to one another, of being humble and not being judgmental. We are going to get through this together. Amen. And so, AJ, as we conclude this State of the Union or State of the Pandemic address, would you mind closing us in prayer?
Yeah, let's pray. Father, thanks for bringing us this far on a journey that none of us wish we were on. God, you know some of us are tired and worn down. All of us are ready for this to be done. None of us want to see unnecessary loss of life or serious illness. And Father, balancing and navigating all those different tensions and realities is hard. But God, I genuinely believe that there's no good reason why we can't come through this well. And we're asking for your strength and your help to do that. And Father, even more so than your help and strength on the kind of logistical and mechanical stuff, we pray that you would keep our hearts soft towards each other, keep our hearts unified with each other, help us to be a whole lot more compassionate than we are judgmental. Help us to realize that even when it comes to COVID, we have so much more in common in Christ than we could ever have that would separate or divide us. God, help us to have respect for where each other are at in terms of fears and concerns and apprehensions and all that kind of stuff. And God, I do pray that you would bring not just our church, but our world through this pandemic and soon. We ask this all in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.